This is Structure 1515, where we have 15 minutes of presentation. I try to keep myself to that, and then 15 minutes or longer, if you wish, of conversation. We are now on number 6, session 6 on donor dynamics, particularly donors as partners in international partnership programs. And because I'm keeping myself to the time, I am going to start right up with the presentation. So this is the slide that I start with every time. And it's really just to say that just because you don't name a thing doesn't mean it isn't a thing. I am on a mission to name international partnership programs, to give them some visibility, to help with understanding, and ultimately to also help improve the way we structure and design and practice this really interesting and effective modality in the international arena. So we're going to start with a quick definition. International partnership programs, we are in the international arena, and that means at least one or more international partners. It can be sovereigns, multilaterals, international organizations, usually many of them. But the key part of the definition is that we are combining the new and the old. It's a kind of combo, hybrid, where we start with an existing entity, so existing infrastructure through a supporting entity that then adds on a partnership aspect through a governing body, through some kind of governing or partnership collective that is supported by that supporting entity. And that's it. That's the definition, those two essential ingredients in this hybrid form. Now, the reality is that there's usually a third piece because these need funding, and that funding is very typically provided by the international form of trust fund. So you may have one or more new and dedicated trust funds that go along with this governing body, both of which are supported by the existing entity. On the one hand, secretariat support for the governing body and trustee, fiduciary financial support for the trust fund. At least those two functions, in addition to many others that the supporting entity can provide. Now, for today's topic on donors, we can also just locate them. They are, of course, participating in the trust fund as donors, but they may also be on the governing body. And many of these donors, the traditional bilateral donors, may also be shareholders or members of the supporting entity. So let's say, for example, the World Bank. Many of you on this call today are familiar with the World Bank, could be such a supporting entity, and many of the donors are members sitting on the board, executive directors of the World Bank. So that's the definition, sort of typical setup, at least the bare bones of it. And now let's just plunge into the topic. So I want to start with a question. What do these three things have in common? Development partners, the Global Fund, and the global partnership. And of course, they have many different things in common, but I'm thinking of a particular thing, and it has to do with the labels. So any takers on this? Any thoughts? Well, here's a clue. All right. And here's another clue. Possibly looking at these labels, we are maybe talking about cases of over-attribution. It's perhaps a pet peeve of mine, but the bottom two, the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria has essentially appropriated the name, the Global Fund, and the Global Partnership for Education has taken the name, the Global Partnership. And of course, in my experience, in my past practice, I have worked on many global funds and many global partnerships. So could it be that? Or maybe we have a different situation here, which would be a case of correcting the emphasis. In other words, at least for the first one, development partners is a term that donors have taken on for themselves, and they want to be perceived as development partners, and supporting entities are also now, many of them, calling donors development partners. Yes, so maybe there's something about this partnering aspect that donors really want to create a perception or renewed emphasis on their role, the way they participate in these international partnership programs. So of course, because they are donors, we can start with this definitionally, and the key factor here is, of course, money. And looking at that, it becomes pretty clear that we're not talking about small change. The OECD DAC talks about official development assistance, ODA, totaling 153 billion in 2019. And much of that is going through trust funds, these international trust funds in these international partnership programs, with trustees that take the fiduciary responsibility. And if we look just at the World Bank, because their annual report that came out last year, their 2020 numbers, so that would be fiscal year July 2019 to June 2020, the World Bank held in trust 37 billion, almost 40 billion. And in that year, there were new contributions of almost 13 and disbursements of close to that much, of almost $11 billion. So this is a significant business line. And lest we not fully appreciate how significant, it is also worth noting that these trust funds in that year financed 60%, more than half of the World Bank's advisory services, basically technical assistance, and a full quarter of World Bank staff costs. Now that's according to the annual report. I mean, it's hard to even see the World Bank existing without this kind of trust fund support, really an essential part of how the World Bank operates. So donors are very key. They bring the money in a big way. And when you do that, the donor position ends up really at the top. And that is from a number of points of view. But essentially, the donor starts the chain by bringing the money to the trustee and inserting this fiduciary layer. So the donor gets some peace of mind and essentially brings on board high standards, technical assistance, supervision, all these things that make up the fiduciary package. And then the chain continues from the upstream to the downstream to the recipients. The beneficiary countries are typically recipients of these funds. And in this package with the fiduciary support, we're also talking about country ownership and good capacity building. So these funds are flowing on a vertical hierarchy. Donors are defining the use from the top. They may even have restricted funds or preferencing, and they want, to quote them, value for money. But this is not a service relationship. It's not a service contract or a vendor status, and they are certainly not getting performance guarantees. So we can talk about that more if we have time afterwards. But it's really helpful to see that there's this vertical upstream to downstream going on in the context of the money, in the context of the fund flows. And yet there are some tempering factors in this environment. And those tempering factors include, of course, what the trustee wants and needs, because the trustee is the other party to this arrangement. But we can go further and say that to at least a degree, another tempering factor is what the recipients want and need. So there are, it may flow from the top, but there are other inputs coming in deciding how those funds are going to be used and how the fiduciary relationship is structured. So what we have is, on the one hand, a negotiation. It's a contractual element between the trustee and the donor, then also the grant agreement downstream. But we also have structural relationships through the partnership. So we'll go into that in a little more detail, but I'd like you to think about this vertical flow, but also appreciate that there are contractual relationships interacting with structural relationships. So let's start with the contractual. And this is to say that when you have funds flowing, particularly in the magnitude that we're talking about, it will always be contractual. So donors are not going to send their money somewhere without signatures on a dotted line. And in this environment, it also tends to be very bilateral. So it's usually one donor with one contribution agreement to the trustee. And these contribution agreements mirror each other. And again, we can talk about that more if we have time later. But it's a deliberately arm's length relationship. The donor is saying, I want my peace of mind, and you're responsible now. So these are as negotiated environments, particularly since we're in the international arena, we have a lot of latitude that way. And so let me just unpack for you at least 3 ways in which we're negotiating. One, of course, is the scope of the fund use. What is the scope of the trust fund? How are the funds to be used? That gets negotiated trust fund by trust fund. That's very trust fund specific. But another area that we negotiate is the donor prerogatives, for example, vis-a-vis fund allocations, like the specific projects that these funds are going to finance. And an area that's really not so negotiated, but at least donors might try to negotiate, is the trustee operating terms, which are usually very standard terms. So for any lawyers on the call, I saw Paul, and perhaps we have others. We always talk about rights and obligations. So it's kind of nice to look at this and recognize, aha, in this environment, it's pretty lopsided. There's one party that has most of the rights and the other party has most of the obligations. So the rights are really on the donor side. The only obligation they tend to have is that they have to provide the funds. And it's the trustee that ends up with all those obligations. Now, on the subject, let's just go back. We talked about the negotiated donor prerogatives. You can probably recognize that out of that list of 3, that's the place where governance comes in. And the issue is, what's the extent of the shared governance? So what we're talking about there is a prerogative which effectively becomes a governing body where a donor or multiple donors will have seats on this governing body, perhaps other entities as well, but the prerogative, quote unquote, and the ability to influence how the trust fund operates, including potentially what the funds are allocated to, comes through this governing body. And that, as we said in the very beginning, is a definitional feature of these international partnership programs. And of course, when we introduce that element, we can see that the donor is now acquiring multiple roles. What used to be a funding role is now also a governing role. And those of you who were with us last month, we talked about conflicts of interest or synergies, are surely recognizing that multiple roles, question mark, which one do we have? Is it a conflict or a synergy? So you may remember it in the vein that we talked about last time. But I also want to pause here long enough to just say there is a whole spectrum of how this kind of prerogative or governing can happen. It can be with or without decision-making, so it can just be advisory. And even with the decision-making, there's a whole series of options as to how much decision-making or decision-making on what. If you go to page 56 in my primer, there's a chart that lays that out, I think, pretty nicely. But here's a question for you. Again, any takers from the audience. Does this decision-making, so if a donor is participating in decision-making on the governing body, does it carry with it any responsibility for the decisions? So for example, if a governing body decides that this is a good project and approves the funding for it, and things go awry, would any of that, come back to the donors in any way? Any thoughts on that? I think, Paul, as a lawyer, you may have some, but those of you who have been in the trenches, have you ever seen a donor have any consequences from decisions that they've made on the governing body, practically speaking?
Andrea?
Yeah.
This is Diana. Hi. I think that with the multi-donors, it kind of helps to sort of distribute the responsibility. And I think that's part of the attraction of it, is that the donors don't necessarily feel individually responsible. If something goes wrong, they can just blame the trust fund.
So Diana, it's great because you're validating my view, which is of course perfect for the teacher. The answer is, at least the way I've seen it play out, is pretty much no. So I think, Diana, you and I are agreeing. I think of it as really Teflon responsibility. They love to be involved, but they're usually not on the hook for decisions they make. And that is understandable from a number of perspectives. I go into it on several pages in my primer. That's you can look those up, 241 to 243, where I talk about collective responsibility. In the end, I mean, several things are driving this. There is, as you say, it's very diffuse. The governing body itself is not a legal entity. The nature of the contribution agreements is to delegate all the responsibilities. So that's what the parties have said, is now the trustees responsible. So it's interesting, and there are obviously some implications. And frankly, the robustness of these trust funds and this business line probably has a lot to do with the fact that until now, at least, you don't usually see donors taking any responsibility for decisions that they're making on these governing bodies. All right, that was a bit of an aside. So let me just, in the interest of time, I'm going to just close out with a couple of slides to make my punchline, and then we can open again for conversation. So what is really quite cool is that when you end up with these governing bodies, because donors are pushing for the prerogative to be more involved, you also have the opportunity to bring the beneficiary countries, the recipients, onto that same governing body. And look at what happened. We started with a vertical line, fund flows going upstream to downstream, collective funding is in a hierarchy, and suddenly we have a horizontal, and that is the collective convening through the governing body. So what is kind of cool is that these governing body situations allow you to flip a vertical relationship into a horizontal relationship, and both are happening at the same time. And this is, of course, very consistent with the Paris Declaration of 2005. It's the true spirit of partnership. As we said last month, you know, conflict of interest or synergies, the view that I proposed is that we can let partnership prevail. And you may remember this was the slide that we looked at last month. So here we are, same diagram. But what happened last time, my example was about the beneficiary countries sitting on this governing body and not being conflicted, even though they were recipients, or at least not prohibitively conflicted. And now we see the same thing with the donors, because of course they too have a secondary role, or multiple roles. So let me pull it all together for you, and then we're going to open the floor. What we have is a vertical relationship that starts with the money, and it goes from the donor to the trustee. So the money is triggering this. That's where a lot of these partnership programs come from, is because there's money available and a desire to do something with it. Money goes to the trustee, and it becomes a contractual relationship. So we go into a contract, which is really between the donor and the supporting entity, because that's where the trustee is housed. That contracted relationship precipitates a further fund flow from the supporting entity as trustee to the recipient. And once the recipient is in view, you can essentially close the circle, connect the dots through a governing body relationship. So you have money triggering the steps, but you start with a contractual relationship, which can become a governing body relationship. And what you really have is a form of symbiosis. So we're back to this diagram where you have a combination of contracts and structure, contribution agreements, grant agreements, together with the governing body. And that is really what partnership is about. That's how you create the synergies. That's how you make the sum, the whole, more than the sum of the parts. And ladies and gentlemen, that is what I call development partners. So that's my punchline. I'm sticking with it, and just encourage you to look further if you would like more information on any of this. There's lots, and I didn't even do my show and tell in the beginning, so let me do it now. Well, I'll do it as soon as we stop sharing the screen. My book for builders is now out. So really both are available. The primer for partners, which has a lot of concepts, the book for builders, which has a lot more on the documents, and particularly a whole chapter on dualities, of which the upstream, downstream, the structure contract, you know, I try to play try to lay all of those out so you can see where you are in the landscape for that. Quick reminder that we'll do this again next month. It may be the last one that we do before the summer. So that'll be May 12th. And we might take a break in the summer and then pick up again in the fall. I have this feeling that the topic I would really like to do next week, and you might be surprised how much is in it, is consensus and no objection decision making. It's kind of not in the logic chain we've been doing, but it is such a practical set of nuts and bolts on how it works, but why also, what it gives you in the international arena. And I've been surprised over the years as to how little is understood about this, even though it's basically the way most of these partnership programs make their decisions. So that's my vote for next time, but I'm open. So if you have other views, please put it in the chat. And maybe we have to continue into the summer if there's so much interest that we keep going. So now time for the conversation. Let me stop the share and bring you all on board. And thank you very much. We'd love to hear your views. Appreciate everyone who's been listening in.
Well, I would just make a vote. Sorry for jumping in first. I actually think that would be a great idea, and I think it would follow actually well from today, right? In the sense that you're focusing on the partnership and sort of synergies perspective, and
that is
what
true.
flows from that is a need to is sort of a need to figure out a way to actually work practically together, right? So I don't know about what others think, but I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. It does actually follow the logic chain that way, Paul. Thank you. So unfortunately, I reached out to try to get a few donors on the call, but I don't think we have any donors, so we'll just have to talk about them. They'll have to speak for themselves at some other point. Nicola, you want to go ahead? It looks like your hand's up.
I do. Well, I agree with your conclusion, and I wondered whether your question was, because you posed the question as does it, but I wondered whether your question should be should it. Should donors bear some responsibility? But I did want to give maybe a little bit of a, if not a flip side, what role can partnerships play in helping to ensure better results on the ground? And that is, yes, the responsibility is delegated to the fiduciaries, so they're carrying out their ordinary supervision, let's say. But if something goes awry, yes, it's the procedures. Typically, in my experience, it's their procedures that apply. But there's this extra layer of scrutiny by the governing body, and that can be a good thing. That there's extra attention and perhaps even extra resources that might be devoted to helping fix the thing that's gone wrong in let's say it's a project, and it's not proceeding satisfactorily for some reason. So it can be. I'm not saying it always is. I've seen examples of both, but I've definitely seen examples where the additional scrutiny at the level of the steering committee has helped. So I did want to put in a plug for it can be a good thing.
Yeah, and I would also add that there are times when, say the client is a difficult or conflict situation, and sometimes, especially if the partners are on the ground, they can help to kind of smooth over some of the conflicts, or if there are issues and they can help to intervene, there can be opportunities for them to be constructive as well.
Yeah, so let me just quickly say, none of what I presented was meant to be judgmental. I am not necessarily doing pros and cons, although honestly, being a partnership person, I would normally advocate having the partnership elements more rather than less. In other words, it's not just about the money, it's about much more, including coordinating and the collaborating. I love your idea, Diana, about smoothing things on the ground. And there are a number of examples where very effectively there's two tiers of governance, right? So you have the global governance, but you also have country level governance that supports that, can also be very effective. It is a plea of mine, in fact, and that's really what my books are, is to say, please make room for the partnership elements, however that comes across. It doesn't have to be structural, but it seems to be appropriate to take advantage of the collective environment and not just commingle the funds, but commingle other resources or pool other resources as well. So I'm very sympathetic to donors who want to be understood as development partners, even though I like to think that the label applies to much more than just them.
Andrea,
yes, Valentina.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a fascinating actually topic, and it's interesting to hear from lawyers that in this particular setting, there is no legal responsibility for donors. That's such a revelation for me. I have worked in fifths and trust funds and never thought about it. What I saw in practice is that some donors are rotating so quickly. They are representatives on the committees and other governing bodies that you end up by essentially building capacity with them. They are, I think it's a form of an operational risk where you have the governing body essentially sometimes not knowing what they are doing. And they are approving things right and left as you essentially, a secretariat, put on the plate for them. But that in itself takes away the responsibility of the donor de facto and in so many ways. And I think they end up with a huge reputational risk, among other things. And there is a risk of them turning around and saying, yes, but you have put it for me on the plate and you allegedly have done all this due diligence and analysis and whatnot. But it's interesting that they would not probably feel responsible for the decision made.
So Valentina, your comments are so rich. There's so much to say there. I think some of that is definitely worth unpacking a little further. First of all, I would say it might be exaggerated to say there is no legal responsibility, but I think in practice, I just have not seen it. I don't know if anyone has seen a case where there's actually been a claim or some legal responsibility that has pierced the veil of the governing body and gone after, say, individual donors that have been meeting in a collective above a fiduciary layer. It's not to say it couldn't happen. And I do think that as some of these partnership programs go into more innovative fields, if you're dealing with vaccinations and, something happens on a large scale, I think it could go beyond reputational risk potentially and be something more. But recall that many of these donors who are making these governing body decisions are indirectly liable through the supporting entity to the extent that they may be shareholders or members of that supporting entity. So they may not feel it directly, but they may feel it through the supporting entity if things go awry. So that's one thing. And I think your other point was really important, which is that I was talking more about legal responsibility, but definitely reputational risk is always kicking around in there. And particularly once you brand these partnership programs, the way the brand works is that it affects everyone. Even if you're a small donor, you're a big donor, it doesn't matter. If you're part of the brand, then you are part of that reputational profile that the partnership might develop over time. But I think I would add to Valentina. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, I worked in extractives, and extractives is, as everyone knows, fraught with possibilities of having problems. And so there were some not INT, I think there was inspection panel related to something that was in extractives, but it wasn't even funded by our trust fund, and we still had blowback from it. So the reputational risk is very strong, and and it may not even be your program. It may be something that's peripherally related to your program that could still have some reputational risks associated with it.
think that's right, Diana. But you probably would have felt it more strongly than even the donors individually, especially to the extent that the World Bank, if as the supporting entity in your particular case, is playing both the trustee and the secretariat roles. I think it'll still be largely reputational risk that the supporting entity has to field, but also all the reason why there's a lot of care in making sure that things are done in ways that will not create that kind of blowback. But the vulnerability is definitely there. And I mean, reputational risk is a whole topic we could still talk about. I'd love to pick up though on one more point that you made, Valentina, which is about the idea that these representatives are rotating so quickly and that has a risk profile in and of itself. So first, I mean, I do have a chapter in my primer where I talk about partners and people, and I'm trying to zero in on the representatives, you know, not just the institutions, but the individuals. And part of what I try to say in that chapter is the relationship of that representative to the institution is really important. You know, shouldn't be out there just, you know, untethered from everything. It needs to feed into a management chain, and managers need to be aware, and it's a two-way street. They need to help the representative know what they're there for. And training is part of it. Training by the institution to be able to represent the institution, the partner. But also many of these partnership programs, especially the big ones that have been around for a while, there's a lot of culture there. There's a lot of legacy and history. And it is, I've seen very effective partnership programs do training for the representatives, like an annual basis, actually say, this is who we are, this is how we work, this is what we expect from you, this is what you can get from us. You know, just a 1 hour, 2 hour workshop that helps bring them on board. And the bigger ones, I think that actually can be really helpful, because you're right. There needs to be enough understanding and like-mindedness at the table for good and responsible decision-making.
Andrea, hi, it's Rita. Sorry.
Yes, hi Rita.
So I'm new and I'm in the same unit with Paul. So it's nice to join the session.
Thank you.
And to learn more about trust funds. I'm just wondering whether so when there's a change in the legal agreement, where in the instance of multi-donor trust fund, where all the donors have to agree if one donor is asking for a change in the legal agreement, whether it rises to the governance body to make a decision. I guess maybe it will still depend on what the change is. It is not going to affect, as you said, reputational risk or any other risk that will affect that. So I'm just thinking through that, because maybe if it's a material change that will affect the trust fund implementation and everything, then maybe it should rise to the level of the governing body making a decision or saying something about the change. So there's something to add. Thank you.
Rita, I appreciate your question. And in a way, you're teeing up next month's discussion on consensus and no objection decision-making. And the connection may not be completely obvious, but one of the ways in which it connects is through the use of a common document, which you can call a charter or something else. And that would be to the extent that these governing bodies own and adopt their own charter, they open up a pathway for making some of these changes very efficiently. You know, one of the bigger themes of my book for builders, and I introduce it in my first chapter in the primer for partners when I talk about like rock, like water, because you build the stability and the flexibility at the same time, and charters are a key piece of that. And so now, just since you've given me the opportunity, my show and tell, if you can, I don't know if you can tell, there's some colored pages in the middle. Let's see if I can get to them. Okay, you see these colored pages? Yeah. That is 80 pages of annotated clauses for charters. So I do a model charter, but it's really like a placeholder. And then I have 80 pages where I unpack each clause. So I think what you're making me realize is next month, when we talk about consensus and no objection decision-making, I'll bring in the charter element so that you can see how that piece can really facilitate the kind of changes and bring in a more collective responsibility, but also a collective approval for many of these changes, especially the ones, as you say, that need to be collectively agreed. Yeah, so thank you for that. You're crystallizing my agenda for next month.
So I don't know if this goes to your next month's agenda, but there's a piece of donor dynamics that I think you might not have had time to get into this time, and that's the dynamics between the donors and how those might play out. And especially going actually to your point about the representatives. What I've seen is you can have the same representatives sitting on multiple governing bodies. And so they develop relationships and they have conversations that can carry into the partnership that you're talking about, but that haven't occurred within the context of the partnership. So they can either be enhancing to the partnership or, depending on what's happening, could be, if not detrimental, at least confusing, because they haven't happened within that conversation space of the partnership. So there's perhaps that element to consider as well, and it might go into your consensus, your decision-making model. But certainly these are dynamics that I've seen playing out. Whoa, where did that? How did that happen?
Well, and I think there's so much we can say on all these things. All these topics, first of all, interrelate with each other, right? So there's lots of overlaps. But the other thing is that looking at it structurally, you're putting your finger on lots of other overlay and overlaps. So yes, there are some of these donors are the same donors across dozens, maybe even hundreds of these partnership programs, and they see each other and they coordinate. And in some cases, you even have constituencies where they're structurally embedded, where they have to be coordinating with each other to be able to take a position. But even more so, you recall I had that little dotted arrow on the first slide. That dotted arrow represents a very strong relationship for many of these donors on the board of the supporting entity. That's a very common feature. It's almost incestuous. So they're talking to each other, not just in this partnership program or across partnership programs, but even in the board, and have special relationships to management. You know, managers are looking to talk to the executive directors, the EDs, and they're looking to talk as well. So there's lots of conversation going on that is in some ways a bit privileged and certainly skews the playing field or the information base in partnerships that go beyond the traditional international players. So going back to Valentina's comment earlier, one of the reasons that I think the dynamics in the partnership that you know very well from the past, it happens to be one of the ones that I mentioned on the slide earlier, those dynamics were compounded in their difficulty because you were dealing with a very diverse set of players. And the introduction of NGOs and CSOs, and even private foundations, goes beyond that very cozy circle where bilateral donors are talking to each other and part of the same board of the same multilateral who also happens to be your supporting entity. So that's a very incestuous environment. And then you bring in some NGOs, some CSOs, even private foundations, and a couple of things happen. One is they no longer have the same information base and not even, or the same value system or the same, vocabulary. It's suddenly a whole different environment coming in, and there's a potential imbalance, but certainly a skew there. And the other is from a legal perspective, and I don't know if Rita and Paul have some insights here, but I've definitely seen cases that are fascinating where normally we're not talking about responsibility or liability beyond reputational risk. But every once in a while you go into things where there is a legal profile where the partners have to be concerned. So for example, we were dealing with intellectual property rights in a partnership and confidentiality agreements, proprietary information. And there was a danger that if that confidential information became public, that would trigger all sorts of indemnifications or, liability that could then flow back to the donors. I don't want to go into too many details. And yet at the table, as we were negotiating the terms for this intellectual property arrangement, how to handle these confidentiality clauses, the entire table was beset with international partners, meaning countries and multilaterals, with the exception of one private foundation that happened to be Gates. Not a surprise, we've seen that many times, and sometimes there's more than one private foundation. And everyone at the table had privileges and immunities except for Gates. So that's an interesting dynamic because, Gates is sitting there saying, hello, but even if something did happen, you guys are all protected anyhow. We're the deep pocket and, whatever, you can extrapolate from that. So these are, I think, somewhat unusual circumstances, but certainly indicate that the exception proves the rule, that usually it's very cozy and everyone feels safe, but it can get more complex in these environments because of the diversity. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I had a few observations and that was one of them, right? That I think the dynamic that you just explained, including the general picture and then the exception with the Gates and the non-sovereigns is an interesting one, right? The legal agreements that we have, and including with non-sovereign private sector actors, because they have to align with what we have for the sovereign, they don't walk and talk like commercial agreements, right? They are, we would say that's because they reflect the nature of these partnerships. These are financing arrangements, that we're agreeing to for a development purpose. And so why would we layer it up with all of this, commercial style legal architecture, right? But there's the question of who the donor is, which may put that in a different light. And then there's also the role of the donor, right? So the role of the donor in a fifth, it can be a lot more direct with respect to decision making than the role of the donor in a multi-donor trust fund, right? That in the multi-donor trust fund, the donor might feel comforted by being able to say, yeah, I was on it, there's a governing body, but we don't really get to do anything. Bank makes all the decisions at the activity level, so perception or otherwise, I don't feel like I'm as connected. Whereas in a fifth, and in some fifths in particular, right, these donors can be, the governing body can be extremely direct in determining, you implementing entity, go back. I don't like the project you submitted. I want you to bring it back like this. So not only did they ultimately make the allocation decision, but they dictated to the implementing entity what they wanted to see in the proposal. So that puts the donors, I think, in a very different position, at least in a theoretical sense, in terms of responsibility for what came after, and so those two factors, it does, I think, raise some interesting questions about I don't know what's the right way to put this, but will it forever be a sustainable model for us to keep these as simple as we'd like them to be? I certainly, from my perspective, would sure as heck hope so, because it will be much more uncomfortable if we have to be having negotiations over indemnification provisions. In a way, it blows up our whole legal model, because that's never going to be consistent, and it puts the bank in a very different position. But you can see how that discussion would ensue from exactly the type of scenario that you just described, right? The more exotic downstream activity that raises issues, and that particularly non-sovereign development partners who start to get nervous. I do think you pointed out another interesting dynamic, which is that most of our donors, certainly by value, are on the boards of these entities that are responsible for implementation in any event, right? So there's a little bit of it is a question of different entry points and what should donor responsibility be, but of course they're members of the entities that are directly responsible for implementation, right? And so perhaps under those circumstances and in the traditional sovereign model, it makes sense not to think too much about donor responsibility. But like I said, you can see in particular the introduction, as you pointed out, of folks who don't come from our traditional cozy sovereign club that makes that analysis a little more complicated.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. I do wonder if, where this takes us over time, particularly as privileges and immunities continue to be under attack. We've already had one major chink in the armor with the JAM case in the US Supreme Court. Mostly though, I think the business model and the legal model have stayed intact so far. And mostly I think that donors don't even see themselves as differently on FIFs, which are really limited trustee international platform type trust funds, as they do on other trust fund governing bodies. You perceive it because you're there with the documents and you're doing the drafting and the negotiating, but I'm not sure that donors fully appreciate the difference. I think they still feel quite protected on FIFs and so far have not had consequences, I think, to change that view. But the dynamic is different for sure, and the context makes a huge difference in terms of how it actually might play out in practice.
Can I just add one more detail? Because we've been talking about the donors being represented on the governing bodies, so in the boards. And I have seen on a couple of occasions misalignment between the representative on the governing body and the representative on the board. The executive director or the ED's staff are really not well informed, that there hasn't been communication between them, and it's resulted in some mixed signals, let's say. And within, just to give the World Bank context, I don't want to give any specific examples, but there have been a couple of uncomfortable situations. And I think especially in the FIF context, because there is that sense the Secretariat is managing the stakeholders in a different way, perhaps from others. It's a little bit, it's challenging for Secretariat staff.
That was just going to be my add-on comment for you, is to say, and aren't we back at the secretariats and how that really, really special but delicate, nuanced group of people has to manage what I'm sure is not just, a hiccup now and again, but actual frictions and, real tensions sometimes. And of course, if you're trying to be efficient and you're trying to reach your goal, that will absorb a lot of the energy, and keep you from moving forward. So, but it's interesting how either the trustee acting as secretariat, depending on your labels, or the secretariat function is ends up being the shock absorber to figure that out and absorb it. And of course, it makes sense because it's also in the supporting entity and has that direct access to all the players, at least in the incestuous context that we've been talking about. But I would say, isn't it interesting? It's very modular, different players have different roles, even though it's the same entity. And just, isn't it helpful to be able to see where you are in the landscape and then manage those relationships? It's much easier to manage them once you know actually what's at play. Yeah, I wonder, we're almost at the hour, so maybe take any last comments. And then I started the session today not having a clear sense of what we would do next month, but I definitely know what we've got on tap for next month. So I look forward to pulling together another set of slides for you, and hopefully all of you can join again next time. Any final thoughts though before we go?
Andrea, I just want to congratulate you on the second book.
Oh, thank you.
I don't think we have a round of applause.
Yes, Paul has it as on display. Yes, I'd like it on your bedroom table right beside you. Might help you fall asleep, but hopefully you'll pick up some good things as you go.
No.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I mean, this has been in the works, but it is, for me, really the complementary piece to the primer, that it needed to come out for you to be able to see how these pieces really work in the documents and work in practice. The dualities chapter is one of my favorites. And maybe it's just the way I think, but it was fun to really think about, oh, we've got this duality. Oh, we got another one over here. And then the chapter on balance tries to tell you, okay, and this is how you make it kind of work. So hopefully good stuff in there. for all sorts of people. Thank you very much. Then look forward to hopefully seeing you in May, and have a wonderful spring in the meantime. Everybody stay healthy.